Subscribe because it's free.
The Galactic Dominion spanned thousands of star systems, ruled by species that had long since mastered war. Their fleets were vast, their weapons precise, their battle strategies calculated down to the millisecond. To them, war was not chaos. It was a science, an equation that always had a predictable outcome. And within this equation, humans were nothing more than a rounding error. The Dominion had studied Earth, of course, a primitive species, still relying on chemical propulsion and ballistics in an age of plasma and energy-based warfare. They were physically unremarkable. No claws, no exoskeleton, no built-in weapons like so many other races. Their technological advancements were erratic, their history a chaotic mess of self-inflicted conflicts. To the high command of the Dominion, humanity was a curiosity at best, but ultimately inconsequential. When humanity was first inducted into the galactic stage, it was not through war, but by necessity. The Dominion had been expanding outward for centuries, absorbing species, conquering worlds, and establishing order. Earth was no different. It was brought into the fold with minimal resistance. Humanity had nothing that could challenge the might of the Dominion. They were given trade routes, access to galactic knowledge, and a place among the lesser races. Not equals. Never equals. The real concern was the Zarkari swarm, a relentless, ever-expanding tide of biological monstrosities, consuming everything in their path. The Dominion had crushed many enemies, but the Zarkari were different. They did not build cities. They did not negotiate. They did not fear death. They only advanced, devouring entire colonies, stripping planets bare, turning every battlefield into a charnel house. The Dominion's highly structured warfare struggled against such an enemy. They fought with precision, but the Zarkari fought with sheer, overwhelming numbers. A war council was held. The Dominion's finest strategists convened, poring over battle reports. Their fleets were holding the line, but only barely. The Zarkari had adapted to energy weapons, their thick carapaces now resistant to Dominion plasma. Traditional tactics were proving ineffective, and with each battle, the swarm learned, evolved, and pressed forward. One council member, an elder tactician from a Vrankai species, suggested using auxiliary forces from lesser races. This was met with immediate resistance. The Dominion had never relied on outsiders to fight their wars. They were the rulers of the galaxy. Why would they stoop to such desperation? But the numbers did not lie. The war was turning against them. The swarm was pushing deeper into Dominion space. New strategies were needed, new soldiers to throw into the grinder. If lesser races could serve as cannon fodder, so be it. That was when the suggestion arose. Humans? A scoff rippled through the chamber. It was an absurd proposal. Humans? The soft-skinned, fragile primates? What could they possibly contribute? They were an unstable, unpredictable species. They lacked discipline, lacked the biological advantages of other races. Their weapons were archaic. Their tactics, if one could even call them that, were erratic and reckless. The Dominion prided itself on order. Humans thrived in chaos. The argument was dismissed. There were better options. Species with natural armor, with enhanced strength, with built-in weapons. What did humans have? Nothing but arrogance. Nothing but their misguided belief that they mattered. The decision was made. Humans would not be involved. The war would be won by the Dominion's own forces, as it always had been. The swarm would fall. The order of the galaxy would be preserved. The war continued. The Dominion continued to lose. Months passed, and the swarm carved deeper into Dominion space. The battle lines fractured, then collapsed. Entire fleets vanished. Planets fell. The High Command convened again, but this time there was no arrogance, no laughter, only the cold realization that if something did not change, the Dominion itself would cease to exist. And so the humans were called, not as equals, not as allies, but as expendable assets. The Dominion expected nothing from them. A species that had never seen true galactic warfare would surely crumble. The Dominion had made a fatal miscalculation. They believed they were bringing humans into their war. Instead, they had just unleashed something far worse than the swarm. The Dominion expected humans to die. That was their purpose. Disposable reinforcements, another layer of bodies to slow the swarm's advance. If they could last long enough to buy time for the Dominion strategists to find a solution, their existence would serve some purpose. No one truly believed they would make a difference. The first deployment was meant to be a test, a minor skirmish on a dying world where the Zarkari had landed. Dominion forces had already suffered heavy casualties, their defensive formations overrun by endless waves of chitinous monsters. The battle was effectively lost. Perfect conditions to see how long the humans would last before they broke. The human ships arrived in crude formations, their vessels lacking the sleek design of Dominion warships. Their weapons were kinetic, solid projectiles instead of energy-based armaments. The Dominion commanders watched from orbit, unimpressed. These primitives would last an hour, perhaps two. Then the battle began. The first shock came when the humans did not take defensive positions. The Dominion had spent centuries perfecting battlefield formations, structuring engagements to minimize casualties and maintain control. Humans ignored all of it. They charged. It was madness. Dominion strategists gasped as human soldiers ran toward the enemy lines instead of holding position. No shields, no advanced armor, just simple ballistic weapons and their own bodies. It was suicide. And yet, the swarm faltered. The first human volleys ripped through the Zarkari ranks with terrifying efficiency. Dominion plasma weapons burned through enemies, yes, but they were designed for precision. Humans didn't care about precision. Their weapons tore apart everything in their path, filling the air with fire and shrapnel, cutting through hardened exoskeletons with sheer kinetic force. Then came the real horror. The swarm reached the human lines, expecting them to break. Instead, the humans met them head-on, not with desperation, but with joy. The Dominion had never seen war like this. Humans fought as if they had been born for it. They did not retreat, did not hesitate. They were adaptable, fast, aggressive in a way that defied logic. They moved together in chaotic yet coordinated attacks, covering each other, pushing forward even when wounded. Dominion soldiers fought to survive. Humans fought to kill. It was in close combat that the true difference was revealed. The swarm had evolved to counter energy-based warfare, but the humans didn't fight like the Dominion. They used their bare hands, their knives, their environment. They broke Zarkari limbs, tore into their enemies with brutal efficiency. Dominion officers watching the battle stood in stunned silence as they saw a human soldier, arm shattered, bleeding from multiple wounds, continue fighting, using his broken limb as a bludgeon. And they didn't stop. That was the worst part. They didn't stop. The Zarkari had never known fear. They had consumed hundreds of species, crushed every enemy in their path. But something was wrong. For the first time in their history, the swarm hesitated. The humans enjoyed the battle. They laughed as they killed. They bled, but they did not fall. Hours passed. The Dominion forces, once resigned to another defeat, now found themselves witnessing the impossible. The humans had won. The battlefield, once a hopeless slaughter, was now silent. The swarm was dead, not retreating, not regrouping. Dead. A Dominion officer, still in shock, sent a transmission to High Command. His voice shook as he spoke. The humans, they butchered them. Word spread quickly. The recordings of the battle were reviewed, analyzed, replayed over and over. The initial response was disbelief. It must have been a fluke, some anomaly. There was no way a species so technologically inferior had just outperformed the greatest military minds of the Dominion. But the reports kept coming. The humans were deployed again. Another battlefield, another victory, and another, and another. The Dominion had sent humans to die. Instead, they had unleashed something far worse than they had ever imagined. The Berserkers of Terra had arrived, and the galaxy would never be the same. The Dominion's war doctrine had been unchanged for centuries. Precision, control, efficiency. Every battle was fought like a mathematical equation, minimizing risk and maximizing calculated victories. Humans broke that equation. At first, Dominion commanders tried to rationalize it. Humans were just reckless. They lacked discipline, and their unpredictability confuse the enemy. But as more battles unfolded, it became clear this was not recklessness. It was something far worse. It was adaptation. Unlike the Dominion, humans did not adhere to rigid strategies. They learned. Every engagement refined their tactics. Every battle made them more efficient. They absorbed every weakness in their enemies, every strength in their own forces. If a strategy failed, they abandoned it without hesitation. If a new method worked, they perfected it within days. Dominion officers watched in horror as human forces did the unthinkable. They improved mid-battle. Their soldiers became faster, deadlier. Their weapons, once deemed primitive, were adjusted and optimized in real time. They repurposed Dominion tech, merging it with their own crude but brutally effective designs. Plasma weapons were fused with projectile firearms, turning standard-issue rifles into unstoppable death machines. But it wasn't just the weapons. It was the way they fought. The Dominion had always believed war was won through overwhelming force and superior technology. Humans showed them another way. They didn't just fight with weapons. They fought with fear. At first, the Zarkari had been relentless, an unyielding force with no concept of retreat. But now they hesitated. Something had changed. The swarm had never encountered an enemy that fought like this. Humans didn't just kill. They hunted. They set traps, lured Zarkari forces into ambushes. They cut off escape routes, not just to win a battle, but to instill dread. They left behind messages, symbols drawn in the blood of their enemies, taunting the swarm with their own losses. They turned war into a psychological weapon. The Zarkari, for the first time in their existence, began avoiding direct engagements. Their hive mind unity, once their greatest strength, was breaking. The fear was spreading. The whispers among captured Zarkari prisoners told the same story. The humans do not stop. They do not break. They do not die. And the Dominion? They were terrified. What had once been an experiment, deploying humans to stall the swarm, was now something far more dangerous. The humans were no longer just soldiers. They were rewriting the rules of war. Dominion generals gathered in secret, watching hours of battle footage, analyzing every detail. They saw human soldiers continuing to fight with broken limbs, using scavenged enemy weapons with terrifying efficiency, adapting on the fly. One high-ranking strategist made a chilling observation. If they have time to evolve, they will surpass us all. The realization sent shockwaves through the highest ranks of the Dominion. The swarm was no longer the greatest threat. The real danger was the species that had just turned war into an art form. The Dominion had called them weak. Now, they had only one question left. Had they just created their own conquerors? The war against the swarm was over. It had taken months of brutal, relentless fighting, but the impossible had happened. Humanity had crushed the Zarkari. The unstoppable tide that had once consumed entire star systems was now reduced to scattered remnants, barely surviving in the darkest corners of the galaxy. The Dominion should have celebrated. Their greatest enemy was no more. The existential threat to their rule had been annihilated, but there was no celebration, because the real threat, the true nightmare, was now standing right beside them. Humanity had changed over the course of the war. The species that had once been seen as fragile, technologically inferior, and insignificant had transformed into something else entirely. They were no longer just another race under Dominion rule. They were something far more dangerous. They were warriors, perfected by war itself. The Dominion's intelligence officers had spent months monitoring human transmissions, trying to understand what drove them. What they found was disturbing. Humans didn't fear war. They didn't see it as a tragedy or a last resort. For them, war was natural, a constant state of being. Every conflict they had ever fought, from the dawn of their existence, had been a training ground. Every advancement in their technology had been designed with destruction in mind. The most terrifying discovery came from human history itself. Unlike most species, who saw peace as a natural order, humanity had thrived in chaos. They had fought each other for millennia, over land, over ideas, over nothing at all. Every empire they had built had been forged through bloodshed, and when those empires fell, they simply built new ones on the bones of the old. They were not a species that fought because they had to. They fought because they enjoyed it. And now, the Dominion had given them a taste of war on a galactic scale. They had unleashed a species that had spent its entire existence perfecting violence. At first, the Dominion tried to keep control. Humanity had been useful, yes, but they were still under Dominion rule. That was how it was supposed to be. But the humans no longer saw themselves as subordinates. They had seen the Dominion struggle, had watched their rigid, outdated strategies fail, and they had won the war for them, not as expendable soldiers, not as pawns, as conquerors. And conquerors do not bow. The first sign of rebellion was subtle. Human officers, once obedient to Dominion command, began making their own decisions without approval. They ignored orders they deemed inefficient. When confronted, they didn't apologize. They laughed. The second sign was more obvious. Human fleets, once integrated into Dominion forces, started operating independently. They no longer waited for permission. They chose their own targets, engaged in battles before the Dominion had even planned them. The final sign was undeniable. A Dominion envoy was sent to a human-controlled sector to re-establish authority. The message was simple. Humanity had served its purpose. The war was over. They would return to their place as a lesser species. The envoy never returned. The only response was a single transmission broadcast across Dominion space. The war is not over. It has only just begun. And then, the first human fleets turned their weapons on their former masters. Dominion strongholds that had stood for centuries fell within days. Their fleets, once the mightiest in the galaxy, crumbled under the relentless onslaught. The humans fought with the same brutal efficiency they had used against the swarm. But this time, there was no external enemy. This time, they were taking what they believed was theirs. World after world fell. Dominion forces, trained to fight in structured formations, were torn apart by human adaptability. The same psychological warfare they had used to break the swarm now shattered Dominion morale. Veterans of the HFY War whispered the same chilling truth. We taught them to fight. We showed them war. And now they will never stop. The Dominion had once ruled the galaxy with absolute certainty, believing themselves to be the greatest military force in existence. Now, they were learning a terrible lesson. They had not enslaved humanity. They had forged them.